All right, well, let me start by thanking Ryan, Nuri, and Andre for hosting this seminar every week. It's actually a really great service to the profession. I've been attending it regularly, as our PhD students have too. So we really appreciate it. I also have to say, this is the last one I'll be able to attend because we're going to start having our brown bag at the same time, the internal USC brown bag. So I know it looks bad that I've been attending all this time and then I present and then I don't attend anymore. But it was out of my control. So I do want to thank the organizers for hosting this every week. And it's a big honor to be able to be part of it. This paper is a new paper, as people always say. And as you can see, I'm the only co-author on this paper. So that means I'm going to rely a lot on your comments to help me and make this a better paper. So please, I'm looking forward to anything you can say, constructive or otherwise. Don't hold back. I need your help to make this a better paper. Also, you'll see this paper is a little bit different than some other stuff that's been presented in the seminar. It's not directly corporate finance, and I'll explain why I started working on it and why I think you might find it interesting. So let me just jump in with the motivation of the paper. This is a paper about public finance, and it's based on cities. And you might not realize how important cities are in the economy. I didn't know this until I started working on this. So of the 10 largest metro areas in the United States, they constitute less than 2% of the total land of the United States, but hold a quarter of the population, and they produce 32% GDP. And of those 10 largest metro areas, they hold more than half of the total urban land value. So this shows just how concentrated economic activity is in the United States in very small, densely populated places. And there's a field of economics about this called urban economics. And what they concentrate on is what they call the benefits of agglomeration, which is another way of saying density. And what density does is it reduces transportation costs, reduces the transaction costs of the economy. It makes it easier for workers to change jobs from one company to another, which is appealing for companies and for workers. It increases the flow of ideas as people just bounce into each other, increasing innovation. This is urban economists have studied about cities. What I'm going to look at is the local government aspect of this. This density requires infrastructure to be successful. The public utilities, like the public sewage systems. So before there was public sewage systems in the United States, cities were actually a really dangerous place to live because of all the disease that came with that high density. And public sewage systems actually were not provided very well by private companies. It used to be that private companies provided a lot of water systems. So water systems helped stop fires. You hear about these great fires in the early 1900s. A lot of that had to do with the fact that they didn't have great water systems and they would run out of water and not enough pressure. There's also, of course, roadways, streetlights, all kinds of things that are necessary for this density and to get these economies of agglomeration. So the other thing that you might not know that, I learned by working on this is that some of the largest organizations, economic organizations, are local governments. So here's an example of the largest employers in LA County. The largest employer is the County of Los Angeles itself, which has 107,000 employees. Second is the school district, that's the city school district. Third is UCLA, then there's the City of Los Angeles with 62,000 employees, federal government, not including the Department of Defense. And then you get down here to Kaiser Permanente, that's the largest private organization in LA County in terms of employees. Now that's a not-for-profit healthcare service. So then you go down state of California, there's USC, 21,000, and then finally you get down here to Northrop Grumman at 16,000 employees. That's the largest for-profit employer in LA County, which is dwarfed by the County of LA, which Northrop Grumman's only like 15% of that. Northrop Grumman's only about 25%, of the city of Los Angeles. So not-for-profit organizations are actually really big employers, big economic agents in the economy. And I kind of think of them in many ways as similar to for-profit private firms. They provide services, all the same. They provide public goods like public safety, a system of laws that are hard to provide private services. Although there are private goods that they provide too. Electricity service, parking garages, education, these can all be provided by a for-profit company, and they often are. So these government organizations are actually doing things that we think of as for-profit organizations doing as well. They also generate income by doing this. And of course, they're different in that they collect taxes, whereas a for-profit doesn't have that authority. But I'm going to show you in this paper that they collect a lot of fees too. That's another way they fund their resources, they fund their expenses, is through direct user charges. And then in terms of how they finance their operations, they have bonds and short-term debt, but they have no equity. So that's a difference as well. But in general, I find them to be quite similar to the kinds of things we study as economists, and particularly in business schools. However, if you look at the research, this area of economic activity is pretty much ignored by us academics in business schools. In finance, we study sometimes municipal bonds, not a whole lot. We focus a lot on government bonds, but they're always federal. And then even public finance scholars who don't tend to be in business schools, they tend to be in economics departments, they focus more on optimal tax schemes. So from the individual's point of view, asking what is the burden of the tax for individuals of this particular type of taxing. So nobody's really looking at the governments as themselves, as an economic entity, as say, comparing it to Amazon or some other private company. So that's what I want to do in this paper is look at the government entities, in particular cities, as economic agents. The other way I can rate this from a finance point of view is to say, I started this one to understand the municipal bonds part of this. And then when I looked, I didn't actually feel comfortable going to the financing part of this, to the balance sheet, until I understood the income statement of these entities. And when I looked, I really didn't find any research on that. And I'll explain why later, why there really wasn't a whole lot of research. I think a lot of it had to do with data issues. But my plan, and I hope you find this interesting, is I think this is a big growth area for us as academics to do. My next paper that I'm working on now is to look at the financing aspect of this, the bond issues. Now that I know what the income statement looks like, I'll feel more comfortable understanding how the bonds are priced and issued and so on. Okay, so this paper has two parts. It's got, the first part is descriptive. Hopefully I don't bore you with just descriptions of the cities. I found it interesting. I hope you do too. I'm going to try to describe their economic activities in big picture questions. So I'm going to ask, how big are these entities? What do they do and how do they raise money? And then the second part of the paper is a very simple analysis really of understanding what determines the expenses and the revenues of a city. And I'm going to focus on these two main determinants, population and income. And let me just give you the answers to these questions, because I know there are other things that you might want to do with your time. So how big are they? They're pretty big. I'm going to show you they're as big as largest public companies. And in many cases, they're bigger than the public companies that are headquartered in the same city. What do they do? Well, they do what you might imagine: public safety, health, and utilities. Some do schools, some don't, but these are the main components of what they spend their money on. I'll be able to show you how much they spend it, how much has changed over time, and how they respond to different changes in the macroeconomy. How do they raise money? Taxes, of course, but as I said, they increasingly use user fees. So they increasingly look more like a for-profit business. And then on the analysis of the underlying factors, I'm going to show you that expenses are tied to the population size, but revenues are tied to the income. And what this is going to lead to is a predictable trend in income expenses, the revenues minus expenses based on population and income growth. Sorry. All right. Maybe I should stop there and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions so far. So the first question is, what is the objective function of the local government?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's actually one reason why I think people have not studied governments, local governments, as much as for-profit, because we imagine for-profit companies, we know what their objective is to make profit. But for a local government, what are they trying to maximize? I'm going to give you a theoretical framework for this, which is the theoretical framework is from a club model where they're trying to provide public benefits to their citizens at cost, basically, at the lowest cost possible. And there are a lot of theories in economics about local provision of public goods. One of the most famous is the Tybalt model, in which local governments provide public goods and they provide different bundles of it at different prices, different taxes, and then people move to where they want to be. So the objective function is not exactly clear. And it's another thing that I think is interesting about local governments and how it relates to we as corporate finance academics generally think about things is that you have giant agency problems here too. So even if you had a stated objective function of the local government, you still have an agency concern where you have the managers or the mayors who might have their own interests, and those would probably be pretty clear. They're trying to maximize their own welfare. Okay, yeah. Next question.
Next question. You may want, or suggestion. You may want to compare the to total private employment in LA or California. Also, there are firms with bigger total employment. May give you some interesting diff and diff.
Okay, yeah, that's great. That's very useful. Yeah, the fact that LA City has so many employees in the city of Los Angeles is not surprising. You can't compare it to Walmart that has way more employees because they're spread over the entire world. But from a local point of view, it's interesting to know just how big they are. So it's good to kind of compare. I'll show you how I compare them to the public companies, and that might help. That might give some context to these numbers.
Okay, there's one more question at this point. Do city governments also raise money by way of equity holdings in companies through dividends, for example?
Right. I'm not sure. That's the second part of the paper I'm working on, the second paper on the balance sheet. From what I understand, I don't see that a whole lot. There are public-private partnerships where the government contributes money and private citizens contribute money to make, say, a stadium or a community center. But I don't think there's any equity involved. But I don't know for sure. That's an interesting question.
That was the last question.
All right, great, thanks. All right, so here's the theoretical framework that I'm going to use. It's this paper by Buchanan from 1965. It's a theory of clubs, which some of the stuff might not be in your area. I didn't know, so I looked how many papers had cited this Buchanan paper. In total, there's about 5,000 citations. Top 3 finance journals, there's one since this was published. So it's probably not something you're that familiar with, but I think it's actually a really cool theory and really applicable. He wrote it more as a general model of clubs, like a country club or a golf club, but people have since applied it to cities. So I'm not going to test this model. It's just going to give me some framework for thinking about cities, their objective functions, and what we should be looking at to understand what makes them tick. So what happens in the model is that you have members of the club, they pool the resources to make a local public good. What makes a local public good is that you can exclude non-members. So for instance, a school district could be a public good, and unless you live in the city, you don't get to go to the school. So the benefits in the model, you get a positive externality of more members originally. So that's what the agglomeration is. By having just more people in your golf club, for instance, you get better contacts, you meet more people. It's a positive thing. But then when you have too many people, it's reducing the benefit of the public good, just like a public road gets too much traffic. So there's congestion. The costs, though, are always decreasing as you include more members because you spread the costs out over everybody. There's a fixed cost that gets reduced for per capita expenses. So then in equilibrium, the club is going to be determining both the number of members and the amount of the public good that it produces. So the amount of the public good is going to be based on the benefits of adding another member and the cost of another member. And in equilibrium, those things will equal. And that will determine how big the city is in the city's application and how many public goods they're producing, the size of expenses. And then also in the model, just like any model that has a budget constraint, when you have higher income, you want to buy more of the public good. Okay, so you can think of a city as a club. The residents are pooling their resources. They get taxes. They collect taxes to make the public good. And then you can exclude non-residents from good. So again, I'm not going to test this theory. I'm just going to use it to frame what I'm looking at. I'm going to concentrate on the importance of population and income, the personal income of the city residents to understand city government operations. Okay, so let me talk about the data. As I said, the data is part of what makes this paper new, and part of the reason why I think people haven't looked at this in the past. So I'm going to be using these comprehensive annual financial reports. This is a lot like a corporate annual report. I'll show you an example. These were only required by the Government Accounting Standards Board since 2003. And what's good about them is, compared to before, they're audited. They are government-wide, meaning that they have to provide a accounting statement of the entire government in one unified framework. Before, and they still do this, they do it at the time they report these government-wide reports, they report fund basis. So if you ever look at reporting, it's on a particular general fund or the fund for this project or the fund for that project, which makes it hard to compare. These new reports also have to use full accrual basis accounting. This is what corporate accounting uses as well. Before, they were mixed basis. Some of the things were full and some were modified, even within the same report. So it was really pretty messy. They also are required to put a net cost presentation by their functional area, which I'll show you that too, which is an advantage over typical corporate reporting. What people have used in the past is this census of governments that the Census Department runs every 5 years and 1 year for big companies, big cities. But that also, those census have the same kind of problems with the data. So you really have to go to these annual reports to get the unified data. So the downside is it has to be collected by hand and cleaned, which turns out to be a lot bigger job than I thought it was going to be when I started. I'll show you exactly why that might be. So here's an example. Here's the city of Dallas. It looks kind of like a corporate annual report. You get a nice picture, and then you come down, and then there's some graphs and figures and pictures of people. And then you get down to this, which is the government version of an income statement. They call it the statement of activities. What you have here on the top rows, you have the expenses per functional area, and then you also have 3 different types of revenues. You have charges for services, which are just direct fees that are paid by consumers. And then you have different kinds of grants. They're either operating grants or capital grants. And then they give you these 3 types of revenues and expenses for each of these different functions. This is what I meant, a net cost presentation by functional area. So you can see, hopefully it's not too small, but you can see there's public safety is listed. They have expenses of $684 million in Dallas. And then they have some charges, 75 million. So they collect revenues directly from people in terms of public safety. But then you can see all the different governmental activities, like works, culture and rec, and so on. They also break it up into what they call governmental activities and business type activities. So at the bottom, you can see there's Dallas Water, Convention Center, the airport, radio. Those are called business type utilities, business type activities. And then the third part are what they call component units. Component units are legally separate entities from the city, but that are controlled by the city. So they have to report them here as well. So I combine all those, the government business type unit. In future research, I could look at each one separately. But one advantage of combining them all is that I don't worry about reclassifications, because sometimes they might reclassify a component unit into a business type activity. There's also transfers between the different components, and that could that could mess up my accounting if I don't just aggregate them. So I aggregate them here. So this is the entire government that I'm going to be looking at, including all of these things, utilities, and then regular government activities. And then down here at the bottom is what's called general revenues. This is where they fill in the expenses that are not covered by grants or charges for services, and they're not specific to a particular program. So here you can see they have an ad valorem tax, a sales tax, franchise tax. They have different types of taxes. Okay, so this is actually a really interesting, it's more complete, I would say, than a corporate finance accounting statement because they break it down by each different function. Okay, so what I did, I started with the 40 most populous cities in the United States in 2000. I ended up having to drop some of the observations. Some I couldn't get the annual reports, not always online. I have to contact the cities. I had to drop all of Milwaukee because their data was not consistent across years. There was a lot of cleaning that I had to do to make this consistent. And in some cases, I couldn't do that. So I ended up with 39 cities over 16 years. That's 600 city year observations. The other major forms that I have here, everything is inflation adjusted to 2018 based on the specific region in which the city is. So sometimes you can get a city-specific inflation measure, sometimes it's just a region. And then the population data is just standard data from the Census Bureau. So one thing to note is that these are not metro statistical areas. These are particular cities. And so there's going to be, then you might think, I'll show you that in a second. All right, maybe I should pause there and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, there are a couple questions. First, how do you account for subsidies or taxes provided from the federal government to the cities, or any transfers from the federal or state government to the city?
Yeah, so those show up in operating grants. So they could be an operating grant or a capital grant. They also show up in the bottom under the general revenues. They sometimes get grants that are not specified for a particular purpose. But for instance, if you see, as you notice in here, Dallas, there's no education. Most of the cities actually have education under the authority of the city. They're under their own jurisdiction, own taxing authority, and their own ability to raise money. But often when it is in the city, if you see education, for instance, in New York City, you'll see a transfer or operating grant, sorry, to education that's coming either from the county or the state and sometimes the federal government. So that's where it shows up, is in the operating grants, which actually is not that big a component. The biggest components are taxes and charges for services in terms of revenues. Okay.
Okay, second question. Do you think local governments are run differently from nonprofits? Any important differences you're able to focus on?
I don't know a whole lot about nonprofits. This is my first foray into this. So I don't know. I'm guessing they probably are run quite differently. They provide different services in cases, but maybe not in others. You know, they're a mix. If you think about this, you know, if you look at Dallas, they have utilities, but they're also private utilities as well. And they're probably going to be run in many similar ways. Plus, utility companies, even private ones, are regulated. So they're going to be similar to private companies. But for not-for-profit, I'm not sure. But it's a good question.
No more questions at this point.
Okay. All right, so let me show you the data. Here are the 40 biggest cities. I keep thinking like a corporate finance person. Here are the 40 biggest cities. Milwaukee, as I said, is dropped out of the sample. But let me show you in terms of population. Of course, New York is number one. It has a population of 8.2 million on average over my sample period. Number two, which is about half as big as Los Angeles, has a population of 3.8 million. Of course, as I said, this is just the city, not the entire metro area. So the metro areas are going to be a lot bigger. And here you can really see that if you look, Atlanta is number 39 on my list. They have 440,000 people, but then again, of course, that is because that is just the city of Atlanta, not all the independent cities that make up the metro area. Okay, but you get a pretty big range here in terms of population. You can see that the lower end is not tremendously big at 400,000 people. The average city is Dallas, or roughly Dallas. The average is 1.1 million, and the median is El Paso with 646,000 people. You know, I would have liked to make this sample bigger. I just ran out of time because it took a lot to collect these data. You have to basically take those PDFs that I showed you and enter them into a computer many times by hand. So, and then make sure you did it the right way. So I stopped at 40 for that reason, but it would be nice to go further. But at the same time, as I get further, there's going to get variation as the cities not going to be that different as you get smaller and smaller. All right, in terms of income, personal income of citizens that live in the city, San Francisco is number one at 103,000 personal income. This is from all sources except Social Security. So, but from dividend income, from capital gains, all types of incomes, on average in San Francisco, they have $103,000 person that lives in the city of San Francisco. It's way above all the rest. The lowest is El Paso with 32,000. So again, you get a lot of variation here. The average personal income is in Dallas, 52,000, and then Philadelphia is at the median of 49,000. Okay, so there's big variation both in population and in personal income of the residents who live in these cities. Now, to give you a little bit of background on the population and income, that will be important later. I broke up the cities into 4 different groups, and I separated them by whether they're above the median population or below, and above the income, the personal income, or below the median personal income in 2003. So I took the 2003 values of this, broke them into 4 groups, and then looked to see what happens over the next 16 years. And that's what this graph is plotting. So what you can see, for instance, is that these purple triangles, these are the large high income cities like New York and San Francisco, Los Angeles. They had low population growth. They only had population growth over the 16 years of about 11%, but high income growth. In contrast, if you look at the small low income cities, the ones, the red circles, they had higher population growth relative to personal income growth. So what this means is the small cities are growing faster than the big cities in terms of population, but the wealthier cities are growing faster in terms of income than are the poorer cities. So populations of the city are converging while the incomes of the residents are diverging over the 16-year period. And this will be important. I'll come back to this later, but this is going to help explain their expenses and the revenues over time. Okay, so let me examples of how this, or some statistics on the size of the city government. So on average, the total expenses of the average city in the average year is $5.4 billion in 2018 dollars. That's roughly equal to Houston's budget. The median is 2.4 billion. That's Dallas. The largest is swamps all the rest. As you can see, New York has an average total expenses of $78 billion. Compared to Fresno at 695 million. So there's huge variation across these cities. Now that's actually one thing that people have not complained about. A concern is, well, they provide different services. New York actually has education, whereas Fresno doesn't. So how can we compare them? And I'm going to look at this and say, well, if we think about this from the government's point of view, it'd be like saying, you know, IBM produces different services than does Dell Computers. So doesn't mean we can't compare them. We still can. They're both still in the same industry, and it's actually interesting to see what they provide and how big they are. Okay. So this is expenses. Revenues are actually very similar numbers. On average, cities have pretty balanced budgets. Sometimes they have laws that force them to have balanced budgets, but not always. If you look at per capita expenses, the average per capita expense per year per person is $4,000 roughly. Long Beach is closest to that. The median is $3,000. Kansas City. The highest is Washington, D.C. per expenses of almost $19,000. So for each person in Washington, D.C., the city spends about $19,000. Now again, that's unique in that Washington doesn't have a state that gives it grants. So that's one reason why it's so big. The smallest is Indianapolis at 1,300. So again, pretty big variation. You can think about this per capita expenses as what's known as a head tax. So just that you could think, if I had to fund all the expenses of the entire, what the city does, including utilities, public safety, everything, how much would I have to charge each person in the city? This would be a head tax. And so you can see in Indianapolis, they're only charging $1,300 per year compared to the average, which is $4,000. The other way you can look at this is normalize it per dollar of personal income. This is kind of like an income tax, as if there was no other revenue source. So if you paid no other taxes other than an income tax, and you pay no charges for services, including utilities, parking tickets, everything, this is how much your tax rate would be on average in cities. So instead of closest to the average, it's 7.5 cents. Median is 6.5 cents in Los Angeles. Washington, D.C., again, they have really big taxes. They have no state taxes. So they have 30 roughly. And then the smallest is Indianapolis again at 2.7 cents. So this is given a sense of the size of how big these governments are and how much people contribute to them. I found it bigger than I imagined, but I didn't know what to expect either. Let me just show a few more statistics, and I'll stop and see if there's questions on this part of it, on the size of the city governments. So what this figure in the red line is a kernel density estimate of the revenues of publicly traded companies in the US in long scale. Okay, and this is in 2018. There you can see the median, it's centered around $1 billion in revenues for a public company in the United States in this time. The blue bars are the cities in my sample. And you can see they actually follow pretty closely to the right tail of the distribution. If I continue to include more cities, I'm not sure how it would look, but it might follow somewhat similar to these publicly traded companies. You can see though that there are some really big companies, big cities, sorry, just as there are really big cities. So I thought that was an interesting comparison as well. In my sample, they're slightly bigger. The median revenues are about 1.75 billion compared to this one, which is about 1 billion for public companies. So some more statistics on how big the cities are related to public companies. 20 out of the 39 cities in my sample have revenues that would put them in the top 5 of the cities that are headquartered in their city. So if you take all the cities, all the companies that are headquartered in a particular city and rank them, and then you inject the city government, they'd be in the top 5 in terms of revenues. So here's an example is in the city of Los Angeles, the city's revenues itself have been greater than all 55 publicly traded companies headquartered in Los Angeles from 2003 to 2014. In New York City's revenues are at the 98th percentile of the 300 public companies are headquartered in New York City. So the city government is really big. Here are some more examples. If you just say, what the publicly traded company that has the closest revenues to the city in which it's headquartered, you get this list. So Atlanta, for instance, the revenues are equivalent to the revenues of Equifax. In Baltimore, the revenues of the city are equivalent to T. Rowe Price, sorry, which is a top 5 mutual fund manager. Denver, it's the same as Molson Coors, second largest brewer. San Francisco, it's Visa. New York City, depending on the year, it could be Goldman Sachs, Stanley, Citigroup. These all have the same revenues as the city of New York. I found this really interesting because when you think about, for instance, governance, you know, we talk a lot about diversity in the governance of and the management of large private companies. Well, you actually get a lot of diversity in really big organizations through city governments, because a lot of these cities have mayors and city councils that are very diverse, both on race and also on gender. I think that's also a really interesting aspect of this. Why they're different, I'm not sure. You know, maybe it goes back to the objective function of the city versus the investors. All right, let me pause there, see if there's any questions.
I had a question. So the inflation adjustments, do they account for cost like of shelter?
Well, so the inflation, no, so let me think. The inflation adjustments are urban consumer goods prices. Okay. So they're not, they're not based on house prices. Okay. You know, the other challenge with this, and something that I wish I could do better, is to compare across cities, because the inflation will adjust within a city's time series pretty well, I think. Maybe not for the cost of housing, which is an important component. But across cities, there's different price levels that it's difficult to control for. Yeah, so the fact that people have much higher income in San Francisco might not mean much in terms of purchasing power relative to Dallas, because the cost of housing, because the cost of food, because the cost of everything is higher in San Francisco. So that's something that I control for. So when I look at within city variation, I'll be able to control for that. And when I control for income, I help address that. But it's a recurrent problem in studying cross-city comparisons.
Okay.
Any
No other questions now.
Okay. All right. So what this hopefully shows is that governments are large. Maybe you knew that already. But let me show you also that they're getting larger. This is the time series of their revenues and the expenses. On the left-hand side is for the average city. On the right-hand side, it's for the median city. And what you can see is that the revenues, the budgets are getting quite a bit bigger over time. So relative to inflation, city expenses are growing about 25 faster than inflation is growing. If you look at population growth, cities are also growing faster than populations. So again, on the left is the average, on the right is the median. The median city revenue is growing 34% faster than the population is growing within a city. If you look at income though, the average city is growing slower than the amount of personal income growth. So what this means is that population's growing fast, income's growing fast, cities, their budgets are getting, but not as big as not as fast as the incomes of the people who live in the city, at the average city. In the median city, it's not that different. It hasn't changed a whole lot. Okay, so these are just kind of some stylized facts about how city growth relates to the underlying constituencies of their cities. So now, what do the cities spend their money on? Part of cleaning this data is to try to organize it, because all these can use their own names for their own departments. So as I aggregated them up to these 11 functional areas. There's administration, public safety, education, health, public works, neighborhood, culture and rec, utilities, ports, development, and then miscellaneous. And then they always include interest paid, which I'm not going to cover in this talk. It's not part of this paper. But you can see that they actually do quite a range of things, quite a different range of services. And here's what they look like by total dollar value, per capita dollar value, per income, and a fraction of the total budget. So public safety is what dominates the city expenses. It's about 25% of the total city expenses. On a per capita basis, in the average city, it's $838 per person spent on public safety. Or if you think about it as an income tax, this per income, it's about 1.6% of personal income. In total dollar values, it's about $1.2 billion a year spent on public safety. So when I started writing this, I didn't think about the defund the police movement, because I started this quite a long time ago, collecting the data. But it's now somewhat topical when we talk about defunding the police. When they throw out numbers about how much they're defunding the police, a lot of the numbers they put out are actually pretty small numbers relative to the amount of money we spend. Now, I'm not saying we should defund the police or not. I'm just giving context to how big these are. The second thing is, and I'll show you, is that the fraction of money spent per functional area is really constant over time. So that might affect how they think about defunding the police. Okay, but the second biggest expense is education on average, and that's again because most of the cities don't have education expenses. Only 10 cities out of these 39 actually control the education expenses. Of those that do, education is the largest expense, bigger than public safety. The third biggest expense here would be utilities. Now, of course, they're also going to get revenues as well. So in terms of net income, how much money they require to be funded by taxes or other sources, utilities break even on average at the median city, and the average city, they actually make a bit of money, not a whole lot. Similar to ports. Ports also tend to break even on average. Okay, but these are the main ways in which cities spend money is public safety. And so I should also say, what does public safety mean? Public safety includes both police, but also fire and jails. So it's not just 1.2 billion all on police, it's the biggest component of that. Okay, so let me show you some time series. See, over expenses have been increasing relative to inflation. Cap expenses, they've been increasing. As a percent of personal income, been relatively stable. And then the bottom picture is the one that I found actually pretty interesting. The total fraction, the fraction of total expenses on public safety is more or less constant the entire sample period. It goes from like 23.6 to 25.2, something like that. So a really constant amount of money is spent as a fraction of the total budget on public safety. And it's true over these other functions as well. The fraction spent stays relatively constant. What this means is that cities create a budget based not on numbers, but on fractions. So whatever the size of the budget, they're going to allocate a certain fraction to, say, public safety. So again, in the debate about defunding the police, city revenues are going to go down way. City spending on public safety is likely to go down anyway. So even if they say they defund the police, it might just be inconsistent. It might be completely consistent with what they've done in the past. Okay, so so that's the time series of these three major areas of expenses. Let me add this. And now I put up in these others: utilities, public works, and ports. These are large infrastructure type activities, and also get revenues. So you can see utilities have grown quite a bit over this time period in terms of inflation to dollars per capita, whereas the other ones, ports, have remained relatively constant. Although again, just like in total expenses, if you look at the per dollar per income, utilities are declining, which makes sense. So as a city gets well, they don't necessarily just buy more and more electricity or more and more water. So the per dollar of income fraction is going to go down. And again, if you looked at this bottom right, the fraction of total expenses, these are all really pretty constant over this long time period. The other thing I should mention is during this time period, there were big changes in the economy. This is when we had the great financial crisis around 2008, 2009. But you really don't see any of that showing up in terms of how cities allocate their budgets in these pictures. I'll show you some later that might clarify. All right. Any questions so far?
Yeah, we've got a couple questions. First, how do you account for pension expenses, funded and unfunded? Are they allocated to the relevant functional area? For example, police pensions go to public safety?
Yeah, that's right. They do go to safety. That's actually been an issue within public finance reporting in general, and they've had changes in their reporting requirements, but those temporarily show the balance sheet of it. So what cities have done in the past is not report this as a liability. The current spending that they spend on retirement accounts and so on is at the functional area, just like you said. So the pensions that go to the police go to the police. That's part of the reason why you see a big expense on police. This is the pension. But what I'm doing, it'll show up in the functional area reported. It might not show up on the balance sheet. That's not in this paper.
Okay, another question is, and I think he's referring to the relative ranking of these categories. Do you think this is due to diseconomies of scale? Cities become inefficient after a point, perhaps because cost of scaling services is discontinuous. For example, sewer system, waterworks, courts, etc.
Well, yeah, I think there's economy of scale going on in a lot of the service. Part of it depends on what service that you're providing. Police service and education are services that don't scale well, meaning that if you want to get bigger, you just have to hire, as opposed to public works, where you sewer system that can hold lots of people. So there is some diseconomy of scale. I'll show you that later when I look at regressions comparing the population, the income to the expenses, and you'll see that it seems as though sometimes some of these, the average city is growing fast enough, it's now increasing costs to provide the same services.
That's the last question.
Okay, so let me just time. All right, so in revenue, these are the different types of tax. Again, there's a great variety of taxes. I group them into these groups: property tax, income tax, sales tax, business, payment tax, utility, share, automobile, and miscellaneous tax. The property tax is the dominant form. of money for general revenues for taxes. It's about 37% of the total general revenues. This comes from property tax on a per capita basis. The average $700. Sales taxes are the next biggest at 16% on average of general revenues, $277. And then income tax. Some cities don't have any income tax, and some do. There's also, as you can see, your business tax contributes quite. And then these other ones are relatively minor, tax and utility tax. Part of what I hope to do in the future, understand how this tax revenue and the tax revenue influences, say, the pricing of municipal bonds that cities issue. But right now, this is just kind of a stylized facts. Property taxes, sales tax, and income tax, those are the predominant forms of raising general revenues. But this is also, I thought, really interesting, something that I didn't know, to compare taxes versus charges for services. How much money does the city raise from a tax, and how much do they raise by charging you for things that they provide? Like, could be a parking ticket, but it could also be a library card. If you go to, in some places, if you get arrested and you go to jail, they charge you a booking fee. There's all kinds of charges that the city imposes onto the people who are using the services. So what you can see here in the average city, taxes have been rising considerably over time, relative to inflation. Charges for service have been going up. If you look at the median city, which might be a better indicator because you get rid of those outlaws in New York, charges for services and taxes are roughly equal over time. They both contribute about the same amount to the city's revenues. Taxes have increased, and 28% in the median city, increased a lot more. Charges for services have increased a lot more at 40% in the median city. So that was something that I didn't recognize. Again, this makes it seem more like a for-profit business that we're interested in general. Here's what it looks like in per capita taxes versus per capita charges for services. There's a disparity between the average and the median. The average, which is going to have the effects of these bigger cities, have been increasing their taxes while holding charges for services relatively constant at a population adjusted level. But at the median city, you see charges for services have just been increasing steadily, 27% over this time period on a per person basis, whereas taxes are flat. Okay, so this is just a stylized fact about cities and how they operate. Again, look at per income taxes. Now things change. So because incomes are growing quickly, especially in these cities, the charge for services per income have been declining since roughly 2009. Taxes have been constant. In contrast, in the median city, taxes have decreased while charges for services have been increasing relative to income. Okay. So just to complete this picture, let me explain a little bit about, there's also the grants from the Fed and the state. Those tend to be relatively small. If you look at how do they cover expenses, charges, services, and grants are 50% of the expenses. What it means is that taxes actually cover a minority of the expenses of a city government. They get the rest from grants, or if you look at charges for services, it's 30%. Now, of course, we have big utility companies, so that we know that you pay a utility bill. If you exclude the utilities, look just at charges for services, that's still 20%. So things that we think of as traditionally activities in 1/5 of the expenses by direct user fees. So again, not what my expectation of the way a government was going to be. All right, so let me just summarize real quick and go to the last part. So we see the city populations are converging, their incomes are diverging. City governments are big, they're large, and they're getting larger. Safety and utilities are dominating the expenses. Property tax and sales taxes dominate general revenues, and then charge services are an important source of revenue. The main realized fact, I hope you take from the paper, hopefully you find it interesting. So enough with these statistics, let's see regressions. So the regressions are going to look like this. I'm going to try to understand what's determining or how important are certain determinants of the city. So these are the log regressions. I have on the left-hand side the log of the budget item, which is going to be the expenses. And then I'm going to explain that with log of the population and the log of the income per capita. Then I will have time fixed or year fixed effects, and then city fixed effects. This is the general model. The way you can interpret this is in a log format. Betas or elasticities. It means that a 1% increase in population is whatever beta percent increase in that budget item. Now, you can also run this without the city. You could run it across cities because there is big across cities. I do that too. I won't show you those results today, but you can run a between effects model where I'm just looking at the averages of the cities. What you find that what between population and income, the variation we see in the size of budgets across cities is by income than by population. Got an elasticity of like 1/8 versus around 1 for population, looking solely at cities in a cross-sectional format. Okay, but I'm going to look at within version here so that I can control for all the stuff that you worry about that correlates time invariant, like its geography or its government. Those things will get by the city fixed effects. Then the year fixed effects will account for any kind of changes, the general macroeconomy, and so on. Now, I should also say this is unfair because in this seminar, I typically will ask questions about endogeneity. So I'm going to tell you from the beginning, I can't attribute anything to causality here. Income per capita is the cause of the city budget item. Part of it is that I don't have exogenous variation in population or income per capita. And so then if you could think of something else that's to do with that, then you would tell me, we don't really know if it's income per capita or population that's causing it. You're absolutely right. We don't know based on what I'm going to show you here. In my defense, the other thing I would argue, though, is that the models actually predict that these are going to be simultaneously determined, that we should expect would be causation. That in other words, people will move to cities that are a certain amount. So the population is going to be affected by the amount of expenses paid by a city. In fact, this is the type model in which governments provide a certain level of services and people move to get those services at that certain tax rate. Okay, so it would be useful, and I would like to understand this a little bit better. If you can think of the shocks to population or income per capita, it'd be interesting to try that. All right, I should stop. Let's make sure there are no questions with this.
Yeah, we have about 4 questions. 2 of them have to do with the accounting. So let me see. So how do you account for cost allocation between state and local governments? The way costs are allocated between these 2 levels of government might vary across different types of expenses. For example, state governments generally spend a bigger chunk on public welfare than local governments.
Yeah, so I don't account for that in the sense that something like scholars have studied, try to make sure, look at it from an interest point of view. How much taxes am I paying total, not just the city government? Because maybe this particular city, you pay a tax to the city and not to the county, and that other one you pay the tax to the county, the city, but in general they're the same. So I'm not actually addressing that in terms of the analysis. I'm looking from the city's point of view to say, here's a city, here's what they choose to do, or however they decide this is their operations, and this is their taxing authority. Now, in the accounting, there is an accounting number in the statements that addresses that, and there's, for instance, a shared tax. So often there will be a state level sales tax that will then get shared with cities, and that shows up in the general revenues part of the accounting statements, where it will talking about a shared tax. Yeah, so that's would be the answer in terms of the accounting. It does show up that way. It shows up in terms of these operating grants and capital grants. Those are often from from higher levels of government.
Okay, another question is, how do you account for non-residents consuming a portion of the city's expenses incurred? For example, suburbanites working in a metro's primary city.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And from what I'm doing, I can't account for it. Now, there's a possible way of doing that. Well, no, I probably shouldn't say that. What these annual reports also show is, and this goes back to the question: is what are the cities trying to maximize? What's their objective function? I also put statistics on their output of their services. So they'll have statistics on how many streetlights have in this city, how many miles of road, how many potholes they repaired, how many people are arrested, how many people went to the library. Now I attribute that to local people, only to the citizens of that city. I can't know that, but that is a problem in general, and it's a problem with using the club theory too, because the club theory says you can exclude people. You know, you have a country club, only the people in that country club can play golf there. But in a city, you're right that there is that other residents of other cities can go and use those services. So it's a challenge, and actually something that cities I know struggle with. Where I, for instance, Santa Monica has a much better library than does the city of Los Angeles, at least in my neighborhood. And it used to be you could just go to the city of Santa Monica and get a library card, but then they started charging if you are not a non. So that might be one way in which to address this. Okay, next question.
Okay, are you able to measure differences in quality of services across cities? Some cities are considered more attractive to live in. Is that related to higher taxes or other attributes?
No, so you're bringing up all these questions that people have concerns about. So this is good. These are the concerns about comparing cross-city service. I would argue that you have the issue if you study Walmart versus Target. They're both in the same industry, but they might have different levels of quality. Maybe it's the same Walmart, but you could pick something else: General Motors and Mercedes. Also, quality, prices. The one thing that people do in this literature is use land values as a way to address those issues as well. There's one art that says what they're actually trying to maximize is land value in the city. Because if the land value, then that's an indicator that they're providing good services at good cost. And so that I could try to add to the data as well.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more, then I'm going to hold off on some of these others. Do you think your results vary by whether the population growth comes from births versus movers? Moving into or between your set of cities can be related to changes in income.
Yeah, there is certainly there is a relation between population and income per capita. I don't know if it's from migration or not. What I do know is that there is certainly migration from, say, if you look at the migration pattern, you see from Los Angeles and San Francisco to Dallas and Houston and San Antonio. So there's certainly migration. How much is from births versus migration? I'm not sure. I don't know if that would change anything either in terms of what I think they're trying to do. And I'll show you in these next set of tests how it relates to population, which might help answer your question. Okay, so I'll continue on unless you have any others that you want to ask now.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right, so here's the main result of these ones. I run it in three ways. So inside variables either in the log values, per capita, or per income. They're going to be mechanically related. So don't worry about that part of it. I can explain it. But if we just concentrate on the log values, that's just going to be an estimate of the elasticity of population to expenses and income to expenses. So what you can see here is when population increases by 1% in a within city test, so looking at the time series controlling for the city fixed effects. When you look within the city, what you see is that expenses increase by 1.8% for every 1% increase in population. And that's statistically different than 1. It's greater than 1. If you look at the revenues increase 1.27%, which is statistically equivalent to 1, so unit elasticity. So as population increases, expenses increase faster than revenues. You can see in terms of this per capita number, it's actually not significant, but this tells you that the point estimate is saying that as population gets bigger, the person is bigger. This goes back to the diseconomies of scale. So at some point, you might, at early stages, there's the economy scale that you can spread out the public services over more. But then as population gets too big, in my sample, it seems like it's getting too big and creating diseconomies of scale, because now it's getting more costly per person to provide those services. If you look at income, income has a different pattern. The expenses, the elasticity of expenses to income is statistically less than 1. It's equal to 0, that 0.245. The little c means it's statistically different than 1. For the expenses related to income, if you look at revenues, they're 0.7, and that's statistically equal to 1. So what this means is that as income goes up, expenses increase by a smaller fraction than 1%, and revenues increase with unit elasticity. So an increase in income leads to a 1%, or is associated with a 1% increase in revenues. Okay, so if we put this together, what does this mean? So as the population grows, expenses are increasing faster than the population growth. The revenues are growing at the same rate as the population. The expenses are going faster than the revenues. As the income grows, expenses grow at a slower rate than the income growth, and revenues grow at the same rate as income, so revenue growing faster than expenses. So, and what this means is that cities are providing services, they're making expenses based on the population on a ratio that's greater, has elasticity greater than 1, but revenue that the cities take in is based on personal income. So back to our original, if we think about the distribution of cities, you get something that looks like this. So on the horizontal axis is the personal per capita income growth minus population growth. So the cities that are on the right side of this figure have greater growth income than they do population. On the vertical axis is the city's government's revenue growth minus the city's expenses growth. So the cities on the top of this figure are the cities in which the revenues of the city are faster than the expenses. And you can see there's actually a really strong pattern there, a positive relationship. So the cities that, sorry, didn't mean to do that yet. The cities that have had greater growth in income than they have in population have also seen greater growth in their revenues than they have in their expenses. So their net incomes are going to be getting either more positive, I guess you say, or less negative. It doesn't mean that they have positive net incomes. New York City tends to have negative net income, their expenses and their revenues, but in time trend, it's getting smaller, that you can see here in New York City. So if we can compare this to that chart I showed you before, if we go back and look at that original breakdown of those 4 groups of types of cities, what you can see is that the cities over here on the top right corner of the right graph, these are the cities that were the large high income cities in 2003 that had a lot of income growth and not a lot of population growth. So San Francisco and Jose, these are the countries in which the main version of this. So they haven't grown much in population, but they have grown a lot in terms of the income of their residents. And what you see here is that the revenues of the city are growing much faster than the expenses are, okay? Because what this shows, revenues are based on incomes, expenses are based on population. If you look down in the bottom left corner, you see Fort Worth and Charlotte, Columbus, Ohio, Phoenix. These are the large cities but low incomes. So these low income cities had low income growth over the time period. And that income growth was when the population was. City expenses are based on population. These cities like Fort Worth, they have higher growth rates and expenses than their revenues. There's a path dependence because these are based on 2003 values over the next 6 years. Okay, so, and I don't see any reason why this would stop. So you still see this divergence now in terms of city governments, their expenses and the revenues that you see in the path dependence of growth population and income. Okay, so there's more to look at this at the functional level, and what you see is that the major functions in the city follow the same patterns as over. So public safety, health, public works, admin expenses, those are more sensitive to population than income. Those are the factors driving this, just major sources. There's no surprises there. Let me see if there's any questions at this point.
We've got a couple questions. You've only got 5 minutes. Do you want to take them?
I'm almost done. Yeah, I'll take these questions because the last part's easy to show.
Okay, so one question has to do with controlling for the mayor's characteristics, or perhaps maybe the city council.
Yeah, that would be something that I'd like to, oh, sorry, go ahead, continue.
There's a second part. Would more specifically, would the political affiliation of the mayor and the governor also affect the revenues and expenses?
Yeah, potentially. Though what you'd probably find is that in these cities, I don't know, actually, I shouldn't speculate. A lot of them are Democratic, but that's something that I think is really interesting. There's one interest is the political party of the government, but there's also cities have different forms of government. Some are ruled by what they call a strong mayor, where the mayor has a tremendous amount of control, and then they have an advisor. And others are run by a city council, and the mayor is more like a manager and just kind of implements whatever the city council put together. Those two types of governments might also influence this. Again, I think there's a growth area for us to think about these issues, especially now that the data is there that we can empirically test them.
Okay. What about consolidation with surrounding municipalities? Does that happen?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, does that happen with these big cities?
It certainly can. I don't control for that in what I'm looking at, so I don't know if that's actually happening or not.
Okay.
That's something that I thought about, and I thought that actually makes this more interesting than why did I choose city governments as opposed to county or state. If I think cities are more like companies, and that they can grow by annexing local regions, just like you can make a merger. And you can also divest, because I know some cities, sometimes they have secession plans where part of the city will just split off. But I haven't addressed it here.
Okay, a couple more questions. Somebody says, not to get political, but the rich are getting richer.
Yes, that's correct. The rich are getting richer, and there are fewer people around them as they do it, like in San Francisco.
To what extent does growth in expenses reflect an increase in quantity and quality of services? And to what extent could it be evidence of cost disease?
Yeah, so that might be something that I want to try and dig out all those data on. Are they producing more stuff, like more traffic lights, and do they have more police officers on the ground? Or is it something else? Is it something for their money? And that's something I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, there's one more question, and we're going to hold any other questions that come in until the end. As income grows, is there a greater demand for services or quality of services by residents, or these services are provided privately?
I think what the data are showing is that there isn't a greater increase in demand for services, because the expenses are not growing with income. They're growing with population. So what you see is that the expenses are sensitive to how many people there are in the city, right? The city is going to spend a certain amount of resources just police the streets if there are more people. But income grows, they're shifting to private sources, but they're not increasing the size of the expenses with their income. All right, so I'll just finish up here. I got just a couple more things. So now that I can look at the time series controlling for the population and the income and the city fixed effects. Now we got a different picture of what's going on in these cities. And what you can see is that expenses and revenues were increasing relative to their benchmark. These are in log values. So you can interpret these changes away from 2003 as percentages. So in 2009, the city governments reached their peak in terms of expenses and revenues. They were pretty pro-cyclical. And then what you see is there's a decline in city government size, both in expenses and revenues during the financial crisis. And then it stayed low. They haven't come back to size as they were back in 2003. And you can also see that expenses have declined, continued to decline while revenue increased. And I'll show you that that's probably based in part on charges for services. If you look at the three major functions of the government, what they spend their money on, you see the public safety increased again through 2009, and then in the financial crisis, it decreased. And so this kind of tells us about, when we talk about defunding the police, is public safety expenses, are they larger now than they were before? They're actually pretty much what they were in 2003. So they had increased considerably, but then they've also decreased during the financial crisis. So they're not exorbitant compared to the average based on population and income and city history. In contrast, what you see, and this is quite interesting, I thought, was health. Health was really pro-cyclical. So when the economy took a downturn, health services went way down, dropping by, you can see, more than 30% spending on health services. This is hospital expenses mainly. Admin, this is general, didn't decrease as much, but both of them, all of them, increased back when the economy ramped back up. So now health services expenses are actually higher than they were in 2003. Okay, so that's interesting change from just the summary statistics. And then the last thing is, if you look at charges for services relative to their benchmark in 2003 and taxes, you can see that starting with the financial crisis, tax revenue has fallen considerably and it never came back. So taxes haven't been reverting, but charges for services has come back, has increased and stayed high. So there's been a shift, a substitution of taxes for charges for services. All right, I think I'm out of time. So let me just summarize. I think city governments are important economic institutions. They're really large employers. They have a big impact on the economy and they're getting bigger. They provide all kinds of services. There's this trend towards direct user fees. There's some path dependence. And I think in general, I'm hoping this is somewhat of an advertisement to study this area. I think there's a lot that we could contribute. We as finance scholars could contribute a lot to this area of understanding municipal finance and city operations. So thanks very much. I really appreciate it. And again, thanks to the organizers for asking me to give this talk and for organizing this seminar every week.
Well, thanks again, Ken, on behalf of UIC and MSU, and I'm sure everybody else who was participating today. Thanks again. Please join us next week. Again, we're sorry that Ken won't be here. We're going to miss seeing you around. But for those of you who will be, Claudia Custodio is going to be presenting her research. Thanks.